Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Well, good afternoon. Since I am very social distanced up here, I'm going to take this off so you can actually understand what I'm saying. My name is Bill Robinson. I'm the head of the Department of History and Political Science, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's installment of the 2020 Then and Now History and Politics Lecture Series for Fanfare. This is one we sponsor every year. It's a little bit different this year in 2 respects. One, we have cut down the number of lectures because of COVID-19, and we've also cut down the size of the audience because of COVID-19. So thank you to those of you who are here in the theater today. Thank you to those of you who are watching the live stream, and looking into the future, thank you to those of you who are going to watch it once it's edited and put up on the Southeastern Channel. I want to thank the Southeastern Channel for helping us to do the live stream, and also Dr. Tina Golding, our provost, who is here, as she almost always is, for our lectures. We really do appreciate that. One of the things we've been doing in recent years with this lecture series is highlighting the work of some of our students, particularly our graduate students, and that's what we are doing today. Joseph, or Joey RICCI, as we know him, describes himself as someone who, when other kids were going to Disneyland, went to Civil War battlefields, and he still does. Also, I think he more or less grew up in the Civil War Museum in New Orleans, which is one of the reasons he is as familiar with that conflict as he is. Joey was recently given a special graduate fellowship here at Southeastern. He has also spoken to a number of Civil War roundtables all over the South, and eaten a lot of good barbecue, I think, as a result of that. And he and his colleague, Bo Trisler, who just walked in here, host a podcast called the Homebrew History Podcast, which I urge you to check out if you have not done so already. They interview some pretty heavy-hitting historians, and when that's not possible, they interview me. But it's a lot of fun. It's pretty informal and very informative. Joey has been working on the Battle of Franklin, I think probably since he was in diapers or shortly thereafter, and probably knows about as much about it as anybody who has ever lived. So I'm going to get out of his way and let him talk to you about it. Please join me in welcoming Joseph RICCI.
Similarly, I'm going to take off my mask so that you can hear me and understand what I am saying. Let's see, that's a good one to start out with, and we'll put that over here. Yeah. All right. First, my sincere thanks to Dr. Robeson and the entire Department of History and Political Science for inviting me to speak here today. Like he mentioned, I've traveled all over to different roundtables, so it's always fun to be on my home turf, if you will. So I'd like to dive right in. The story of the November 30th, 1864 Battle of Franklin has not been properly interpreted for almost 150 years. From the moment that the first official report was filed, the story has been corrupted by competing narratives. Through the amalgamation of truth, the wrong men have been given credit for the victory, and the wrong men have been blamed for the disaster on the advanced federal line. As the first historian and veteran of the battle, Jacob D. Cox, wrote when in 1897 contemplating the importance of the battle, he said that, quote, "It was for a long time greatly misunderstood, Controversies of all sorts grew out of it. The same problem confronts us today. It is time then to reconsider the stories that we have taken and they have grown to dominate the narrative of the Battle of Franklin. In the process of that reconsideration, as layers of time and memory are peeled back, a new narrative emerges in the truth. In the days, weeks, and years following the Battle of Franklin and the death of our protagonist, if you will, George Day Wagner, both he and the battle became synonymous with failure and disaster. But it is my intention to present a challenge to that popular narrative. We should, first, attempt to put matters into perspective. Following the capture of Atlanta in September of 1864, Federal Major General William Tecumseh Sherman faced one major problem. Although he had defeated Confederate Lieutenant General John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee, he had not taken away their ability to wage war. For nearly a month, the two armies collided on battlefields throughout North Georgia. But Sherman, instead of wasting more time trying to destroy Hood's army on a field of his choosing, chose to send George Thomas, the commander of the Army of the Cumberland, man down there to the bottom right, to Nashville, where he would protect against a northern route of invasion. After arriving in Nashville, he took command of roughly an 8,000-man garrison of mostly non-combatants. They're military auxiliary, so they're iron forge workers, they're cooks, they work in supply depots. And as these army formations assembled from across Tennessee to reinforce Thomas, he felt assured that when the arrival of this force would come, that they would, quote, amount to when concentrated an army nearly as large as that of the enemy. In order for Thomas to build up his army and strengthen the city's defenses, he needed time. And so to enact a delaying force, Sherman also dispatched the commander of the Army of the Ohio's 23rd Corps, Major General John McAllister Schofield, to Pulaski, Tennessee. There he'd meet up and collect an army and try and block John Bell Hood. On November the 14th, he issued Special Field Order number 153, by which he assumed all command of the troops assembling in Pulaski. As early as November the 16th, and as Thomas's reinforcements assembled across the state, Sherman began his march into the heart of the Confederacy. John Schofield marched to meet Hood's army and hold the Confederates at bay long enough for Nashville to be strengthened. Since 1862, Nashville had become the second most fortified city in the United States and one of the Union Army's key supply hubs. Make no mistake, its importance cannot be understated. The common narrative portrays 33-year-old commander of the Confederate Army, John Bell Hood, as an aloof, inept, drug-addicted, cold-blooded murderer with a penchant for vengeance, pitted against an equally incapable adversary with luck, or perhaps providence, on his side. His campaign into Tennessee allegedly centered around chasing dreams of glory. A cursory reading of the more prominent books on the campaign would tell you that John Bell Hood ordered his attack out of anger or lust or recklessness, and that only by sheer luck, or what I will call noble disobedience, was the Union Army able to survive this ferocious attack on November the 30th, 1864. But there's more to the story than just pithy one-liner puns about commanders. The story we've been told for the last 40 years is one that totally dismisses the strategic and operational value of Nashville and thus the entire campaign. To assume Hood was guilty of any of these aforementioned accusations is only an advantage of largely unfounded post-war and modern observations. To be sure, John Bell Hood's Army of Tennessee was a significant threat to the Union assets in Tennessee and Georgia. Now we'd like to introduce our cast of players. A West Point graduate of 1853, John Schofield's war began in Missouri as the chief of staff under Major General Nathaniel Lyon in 1861. After Lyon's death, Schofield assumed command of the Army of the Frontier. Over the course of the war, his ambition and his ability prompted his promotion to various levels of command. By 1864, he reached the rank of Major General and was placed in charge of the 23rd Corps of the Army of the Ohio. With Schofield tasked with commanding the ad hoc army, his senior division commander, commanding the 3rd Division, Major General Jacob D. Cox, assumed command of the Corps. Cox, on the other hand, studied theology and law and served as an Ohio State senator before the war. In 1861, the staunch abolitionist joined the Army as a brigadier general in command of all volunteer soldiers from Ohio. He led a division at the battles of South Mountain and Antietam before assuming command of the 9th Corps as a major general. But by 1863, Cox was demoted and sent to command the District of the Ohio after an excess of major generals was reported to the Congress. During his tenure as commander of the 3rd Division of the 23rd Corps, Cox endeared himself to Schofield and to Sherman. On September the 12th, John Schofield formally endorsed Cox for promotion to Major General, to stay this time, citing his, quote, gallant and meritorious services during the Atlanta campaign, and added that he had no hesitation in saying that he had not seen a more noble and efficient division commander. Major General David Sloan Stanley's 4th Corps, garrisoned at Pulaski, encompassed generally veteran soldiers of the Army of the Cumberland. Stanley himself held various postings throughout the war, including the Chief of Cavalry earlier on under William Rosecrans in 1863. He commanded a division in the 4th Corps under his predecessor, Major General Oliver Otis Howard. Stanley and his 3 division commanders, Nathan Kimball, Thomas John Wood, and the star of our show today, George Day Wagner, fell under the command of Schofield when the 2 corps combined at Pulaski. Though politically appointed to command, Brigadier General George Day Wagner led a successful career defined by determination and raw courage. He gained a reputation as a, quote, great fighter, and in 1909, Captain Levi Tucker Schofield remembered Wagner for his, quote, personal valor and dauntless courage on nearly every of the hard-fought battlefields of the West, end quote. In the Tennessee campaign of 1864, commanding the 2nd Division of Stanley's 4th Corps, Wagner would have another chance to prove himself. To reinforce the opinion that Hood was not some unqualified, unfit commander, it should be noted that his campaign from Florence, Alabama to Spring Hill was a textbook case for maneuver and showcased his skill in flanking attacks. On 2 occasions, once at Columbia and once at Spring Hill, Hood managed to bypass Schofield and ensnare him. At the latter battle, on November the 29th, though, confusion, environmental factors, and the determined stand of a lone division would derail a thus far brilliant campaign. The success, and indeed the survival, of Schofield's blocking force was held in the balance by just a mere few minutes. Moving just south of Spring Hill, about 2 miles south of Spring Hill, and some 25 miles south of Nashville, 4th Corps Commander David Sloan Stanley received an urgent message from a badly scared cavalryman relaying that Buford's division of Forest Cavalry was halfway between the Rally Hill Pike and Spring Hill. So if you'll excuse me to dart over to the map real quick. And up there. Okay. Don't move light on my feet, I don't guess. But at once, Stanley ordered Wagner's division to run at a dead sprint to the north side of Spring Hill and assemble in that semicircular fashion that you see there. Now, what's in Spring Hill? Well, Schofield, knowing that Hood had already flanked him at Columbia, dispatched all of his wagons, all 800 wagons, and the 23rd Corps Reserve artillery to Spring Hill. And they were resting here before pushing on to Franklin, before pushing on to Nashville. With these wagons in jeopardy, obviously, something had to be done. The 1st Brigade under Emerson Opdyke actually sprints almost the whole 2 miles to get to the north side of town. And when they deploy, normally we're thinking of Civil War battlefields and we're thinking of Civil War formations where you're shoulder to shoulder. Opdyke's brigade, there's some evidence that would show that these guys were spaced out almost 12 yards apart from each other over that whole loop that he had to occupy. John Lane's brigade in the center of that semicircular defensive line linked in to the flank of Brigadier General Luther P. Bradley's brigade later on, but for now, Bradley is at the bottom of your screen. He deployed into a battle line with 2 regiments extended to refuse his flank. Successfully, though, the 3 brigades managed to throw back Forrest's attack. Now, we're talking about 5,689 infantry under Wagner, on your far right of your screen. He first takes on about 5,000 cavalrymen from Nathan Bedford Forrest's Corps of Cavalry, but eventually he's going to take on roughly 10,000 infantrymen from Benjamin Cheatham's Corps, the Army of Tennessee. When Forrest sends forward General Chalmers' division of cavalry, Chalmers rides back and says, General, I think that it's infantry occupying Spring Hill. And Forrest kind of arrogantly, maybe a little pridefully, disagrees and leads his own attack and is repulsed. And when he rides back, he finds Chalmers and says, "You was right, Chalmers. They was in there sure enough." Arriving at 3 p.m., Hood sent forward his best commander. Well, I guess we're not going to do that one. Hood sent forward his best commander, Major General Patrick Cleburne, to deliver a striking blow to Schofield's army. During a firefight with regiments from Cleburne's division, Colonel Bradley was severely wounded, a gunshot wound to his right arm, and he was removed from the field. Joseph Conrad took command of the brigade henceforth. After relentless fighting, Cheatham's corps halted almost 150 yards from the pike, the Columbia Pike running straight through the center of that map. The rightmost brigades of Cleburne's division rested completely exposed in the sight of Wagner's line. Under heavy fire, Cleburne had been compelled to fall back and reform with a change of front. Adding to the delay of the coordinated assault by the entire corps, John C. Brown's division had the unenviable task of maneuvering around and over the McCutcheon Creek and wheeling almost 180 degrees under heavy fire. Typical of late fall days, the sun started to set, and by the time all three divisions deployed and were ready to conduct an assault, it was dark. Wagner's soldiers had checked the enthusiastic assault of Cleburne's division, had thrown back Nathan Bedford Forrest, and held back a concentrated advance of Cheatham's entire corps. That night, the balance of the 4th and 23rd Corps marched past Spring Hill onto Franklin, uncontested, on the Columbia Pike, less than 100 yards away from their Confederate adversary. Lane and Conrad's brigades marched in the stealthy column. There you'll see them at the top. I don't know if you can see that or not, but they pass on this Columbia Pike up through Spring Hill, and Wagner's division is actually the last one to pull out. They will conduct a rearguard operation the entire rest of the way to Franklin. Wagner's success in driving back this attack bought Schofield time and allowed him to evacuate the rest of his army. The delaying action from Columbia to Spring Hill and from there to Franklin slowed Hood's advance. The importance of the victory at Spring Hill cannot be understated. Wagner's men turned back an assault by arguably the best soldiers in the Army of Tennessee and saved Schofield's force from annihilation. In later years, David Stanley echoed the remarks made by Adam Badeau in his Life of Grant, saying, quote, "Nashville, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Chicago were defended at Spring Hill." But the story perpetuated by the writers of history focuses on a Confederate command paralysis, and if you excuse me, we're going to jump back a couple slides. This is a corruption to the story that is matched only by the telling of the events of the next day's battle. This group could not cooperate with each other. Orders would pass from Hood to his corps commander at the top right of the screen, Benjamin Cheatham. But Cheatham misinterpreted his orders. So when he misinterprets them, obviously what he relays to his division commanders, Cleburne, Bate, and Brown, is something a little bit different than what Hood had intended. It's kind of like playing telephone when you're a little kid. And oh my goodness, I have no idea what it did. Huh. Uh-oh. Now we go starting again. One more. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Arriving at 4 a.m., Schofield, who rode at the head of Major General Jacob D. Cox's division, planned to move his 800 wagons and his artillery and his men across the Harpeth River. Flows right around the back of Franklin there. And you'll see that there's two bridges right here, just off the map. These are the bridges that Schofield intends to cross. However, when he gets there, he discovers that the bridges are damaged, in one instance having been washed away. And so he orders his engineer corps to come up and begin replanking the bridge. And to his credit, they're successful in getting this done, but it's a very time-consuming process, and they still have to move these wagons and the artillery across. At first, they're only sending 2 wagons at a time, but by around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're really rolling these wagons across the bridge. To make matters worse, the pontoon bridges that he had requested from Nashville never arrived. So the 2 federal corps are now trapped by the swollen Harpeth River to the north, and the Army of Tennessee to the south became determined to hold their ground long enough for the army to cross. Cox's men fortified themselves behind earthen defenses in a crescent shape stretching from each bank of the Harpeth River around the town. Riflemen threw up headlogs made of fence rails, wood siding, and branches across the federal line. Fountain Branch Carter, owner of the Carter House seen there at the bottom of your screen, and the surrounding property, allowed General Cox, now commanding the fortifications in lieu of Schofield, to establish his headquarters in the family home. Federal artillerymen deployed their cannons along the position to provide one of the deadliest fields of fire in the entire Civil War over open farmland. Wagner's division, with Whitaker's brigade of Nathan Kimball's division, including one section of artillery, continuing in their role as the rear guard, established a line on Stevens and Winstead Hill to the south of town. They're actually just off the map in this picture. All through the early morning hours, though, Wagner's division had halted and deployed atop every hill and rise along the Columbia Pike. And what they would do is they would withdraw. As the Confederates would deploy, they would pull back each time. And that chewed up time. That chews up their pursuer, and they've got to take time to reform on the pike and advance. And it's a continuing game of leapfrog almost. Soon after establishing this first advance line, though, elements of Hood's army appeared on the roads leading into Franklin. As Whitaker received his orders to withdraw to the main line, Wagner, seeing that, ordered his division to begin a retrograde action towards the hills, or from the hills toward town. As the 3 brigades withdrew, Wagner received orders from his corps commander, David Stanley, to return to his position on the hilltops and, quote, hold the heights you now occupy until dark, unless too severely pressed, end quote. The remainder of that order also gave Wagner the command to send Colonel Opdyke's brigade to within the main line of works to act as a reserve. Stanley would not relay another order the entire rest of the day to George Wagner. According to the division commander's official report, he said that the dispositions were scarcely completed before a message from Opdyke warned of advancing heavy columns of infantry on their line, and one by each of the 2 pikes leading into Franklin. Despite this threat of attack, to Schofield and Cox, a full frontal assault seemed doubtful. Thus far, a full engagement had not been attempted. Wagner's division retired from the heights and in a continuance of their orders, continued this sort of rear guard action. And they took a position on the Privet Knob near the near the Merrill House. It's right here. There we go, right there. And they stay here until the Confederate forces began to converge on Winstead Hill and sharpshooters began to take aim at Federal artillerymen. He conducts his final withdrawal to what is now known as the advance line, right here. The orders given to him by Cox, the commandant of the line, were well understood. In contrast to Stanley's hold the heights order, Cox ordered Wagner under no uncertain terms to remain in front of the Federal lines and to retreat in the case of an attack. These orders were, contrary to popular belief, relayed to the 2 forward brigade commanders. Among the soldiers of the 64th Ohio, Sergeant Samuel Libby filed down the Columbia Pike toward the line of Federal earthworks still under construction. His regiment had been on the march and involved in the action for 3 days with little time to eat or sleep. Exhausted to the point of collapse, hungry to the point of frustration, the soldiers of a mile from the main line of works. 1st Brigade, under Colonel Emerson Opdyke, marched past them on the pike. At the head of the column rode the division commander, Wagner, engaged in a conversation with the colonel. Allegedly frustrated, Wagner sent Opdyke to the rear to act as a reserve. This relief from frontline action presented the universally respected commander of the 36th Illinois Infantry, Lieutenant Colonel Porter Olson, an opportunity for a long overdue meal and rest. Soldiers in Opdyke's brigade took advantage of the time to start fires to prepare their food and coffee. Along the outpost line, soldiers of the 64th Ohio threw up hasty barricades in anticipation of an attack. As the brigades of Lane and Conrad deployed, Opdyke allegedly vehemently refused to go into that forward position, and after a discussion, Wagner sends him behind the house. But this Opdyke to the rear incident remains controversial among Civil War aficionados today, as of even 15 minutes ago. According to Captain John Schellenberger of the 64th Ohio, Company B, Wagner and Opdyke traded verbal blows as they rode northward toward town. Opdyke's brigade in tow, Wagner supposedly conceded, saying, "Well, Opdyke, fight when and where you damn well please. We all know you'll fight." However, there are several flaws to this story. Upon consulting both Wagner and Opdyke's official reports, as well as the latter's correspondence with his wife, neither man sheds light on that situation. Wagner's report simply states, "When the command retired from Stevens Hill, I directed Colonel Opdyke to form in the rear of Carter's house, to the right and rear of the main line of works, and act as a reserve." This is exactly as Stanley had ordered. In Opdyke's letter book to Battle for God and the Right, he states that Wagner ordered me to fight wherever and whenever you think best. By these accounts, neither man appeared aware of any controversy over the matter. It is clear, though, that Wagner, in accordance to Stanley's orders, sent Opdyke to the rear, and Cox, as commandant of the line, placed them in reserve. Further examination of Wagner's decision to allow Opdyke to retire also reveals something more, a little nugget, a wrinkle in this complicated story, certainly more complicated than the shouting match that Schellenberger describes, a trope that has dominated the narrative of the battle for over 100 years. Opdyke and his 125th Ohio Regiment of Infantry, of volunteers, had been in Franklin in April of 1863. They were garrisoned there. Opdyke knew the town so well that when he arrived here on November the 30th, 1864, he even visited old friends there. It is likely that Wagner accounted for Opdyke's knowledge of the town and its defensive capability. It is also clear that neither man trusted the defensive position of the army, nor Cox's placement of troops in the works. Having been on rear guard from Spring Hill to Franklin, and the only division deployed at Spring Hill, if either Wagner or Opdyke's tempers flared on the afternoon of the 30th, the constant use and deployment of their division justified it. In the final hours of the assault that would decide the lives of approximately 8,500 soldiers, the Federal Officer Corps at Franklin appeared, oh well, some people are covered up. They weren't like that earlier, but we'll work with it. The Federal Officer Corps at Franklin appeared almost oblivious to the situation that was presented to them. As if certain that Hood would not be foolish enough to charge earthen breastworks this late in the day, and those in position to alter Wagner's placement chose not to. No urgency existed among the ranks, with the exception of their army commander. Schofield went where responsibility called him. He went to the river crossing to oversee the passing of his wagon train. His responsibility remained the safe crossing of his army over the Harpeth. Defense of the town rested with Jacob D. Cox. However, Cox, by his own admission, did not believe Hood's attack to be imminent, and moving away from his headquarters at the Carter House, rode and observed the western flank with his staff. To Cox, Wagner's damnable position so far from the line served as a first line of defense. Even John Schellenberger's report of the battle questions Cox's apparent apathy. Schellenberger states that if Wagner was disobeying orders by remaining in front too long, Cox was watching him do it and took no measures to prevent it. He continued, Cox, fresh from a personal conference with Schofield, to whom he had reported the situation and whose orders he had received in reference to holding the position, looked on quietly and thereby approved of Wagner's action. Stanley, as we mentioned, did not pass on another order to Wagner. A veteran from the 73rd Illinois Infantry recalled, one thing seems evident from all the information obtainable, that neither Schofield nor any of his immediate associates realized the possibility of such an attack as Hood very soon made a most terrible reality. As the Confederates prepared for an assault, Wagner rode to his extended position and, sensing anxiety in the ranks, ordered Lane and Conrad's brigades stuck out front here to hold their position at bayonet point. Perhaps in thinking that the first wagons had already crossed the bridge over the Harpeth and that soon the army would be on the move, Wagner determined to hold until the rest of the soldiers behind the lines made it across. This, after all, was his duty as the commander of a rear guard. Whatever the case, he returned to his observation point just inside the works. I think it's covered up by him in that picture, but right there. And Lane and Conrad's brigades looked on in anticipation. According to an engineering officer in the 23rd Corps, Levi Schofield, runners from the outpost repeatedly warned Wagner of an impending advance, to which he allegedly responded, "Stand there and fight them." To another, he responded, "Go back and tell them to fight. Fight like hell." At 4 p.m., with preparations made, Hood ordered his army forward in a last-ditch effort to destroy Schofield before reaching Nashville. Remembering his orders to withdraw should he face an imminent attack, Colonel Conrad, wrote in his report that the general ordered that if the enemy came on me too strong and in such a force as to overpower me, that I should retire my rear line to the main line of works. But as the enemy was so close to me, and as one half my men were recruits and drafted men, and knowing that if I then retired my lines, my men would become unsteady and confused, and perhaps panic-stricken, I concluded to fight the enemy on the line I then was. So I ordered the men to commence firing. It was a decision that impacted the rest of the day. Sergeant Libby, who I mentioned earlier, a veteran who had not yet re-enlisted, found himself in a precarious situation. With his enlistment up and danger apparent, he sprang from the works, vehemently declaring that he should not submit his life to be thrown away. East of the Columbia Pike, Cleburne's division, as well as Sears' brigade of French's division, drove those Indianans and Ohioans and Illinoisans from their advanced line. The hardened veterans turned face and fled for the fortifications. However, those young green soldiers, being too afraid to run under fire, surrendered to their foe. Because Wagner's men remained out there for so long that by the time they withdrew, only 50 yards separated them from the advancing gray tidal wave of fury. As the forward line broke to the rear in chaos, Libby's body lay lifeless somewhere in the path of retreat. The 100 and 104th Ohio, right here, stretched out along that line there, occupied a position east of the Columbia Pike between the road and the Carter-Cotton Gin. After watching Wagner's division withdraw in a panic, scores of the Ohioans started a hasty retreat for the Harpeth and left a hole in the Federal line roughly 150 yards wide. Hearing the commotion, David Stanley raced to the front. The veteran corps commander stood mounted on his horse in the middle of the Columbia Pike, rallying his retreating soldiers. As files of soldiers bolted past Stanley, some, seeing their corps commander trying to rally their crumbling line, turned about and joined the reserve regiments in an effort to throw back the Confederate brigades of Cockrell, Granbury, Lowry, Gist, Strahl, Govan, and Gordon. As the ranks of the 4th Corps regiments under his command surged forward, a bullet struck Stanley in the neck. Falling from his horse, he was remounted and sent to the rear. Wagner, standing in the middle of the pike, was swept away in the rush, shouting to his men, "Stand by me, boys, and I'll stand by you." Cox, racing from the flank, rode to Opdyke's reserve position and ordered the brigade forward. Left to fend for themselves, some of the more experienced soldiers of Strickland's brigade stood their ground. The reserve brigade here, the 12th and the 16th Kentucky, the 175th Ohio, and the 8th Tennessee, entered the fray joined the rallied veterans of Lane and Conrad's brigades. Up came Opdyke's 7 regiments. Tearing through the Carter Garden and up the Columbia Pike, Opdyke's brigade deployed and entered the fight. Rifles turned into clubs, bayonets, with rifles and bayonets fixed, turned into spears. The struggle was so desperate that Federal artillerymen resorted to using the implements on their cannon as makeshift weapons. Through the combined efforts, though, of Cox and Stanley, actually, come on, man, it's really temperamental, I guess. We don't want to kill them off yet. I'm just going to give up on that, I think. Through the combined efforts of Cox, Stanley, and Opdyke, and the individual commanders of the reserve regiments, the Federals succeeded in shoring up the gap in the line. Until dark, Confederate infantrymen made repeated attempts to dislodge the Federals from their entrenched position. By midnight, Cox and Schofield withdrew their entire army back across the Harpeth and escaped to Nashville. The morning revealed the most haunting sights of the entire Civil War. The Confederate Army had lost 13 of their own generals. There were 6,200 of them, 6,200 Confederates killed. 6 of their generals died, including Patrick Cleburne. The Federals lost 2,326 men, with more than half coming from Wagner's division. Arriving in Nashville, the soldiers of the 4th and 23rd Corps entered the city's impenetrable works, and this is a great quote. It is then that these men, with loyal hearts as big as bushel baskets, with wills made of the firmest cast iron, and muscles and sinews of the finest tempered steel, rested their bodies and fell into a sleep of which they could not be awakened from for 24 hours. They had been on the march and in battle for 3 days, and this was finally their first chance at rest. As Thomas strengthened his defenses in Nashville, Brigadier General Washington Elliott arrived to assume command of A Division. Stock of a military family and veteran of the Mexican War, he held several commands throughout the Civil War, including commanding a division at the Battle of Gettysburg in Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps, and he served in the 1st Cavalry Division in the Army of the Cumberland. He fought in the Atlanta Campaign and participated in Hood's pursuit through North Georgia. His experience, matched only by his tenacity and ability as a commander, made him an obvious candidate for any position in the Army. Reports of the action at Franklin, submitted by Wagner and Opdyke, and Lane and Conrad, each varied in language, but all expressed the same notion. The forward line held either too long through incompetence, deficient confidence, or an excess of bravery. No one doubted that a serious blunder had occurred on the outpost line, but who was responsible? Though it is easy to misconstrue, claims that Wagner's removal from command was a result of the fallout are woefully untrue. Wagner was simply outranked by Washington Elliott. The career soldier, Elliott, the career soldier. Wagner returned to his command as the previous command as the Brigadier General in command of the 2nd Brigade, a short-lived posting. Wagner's wife Frances's health was failing, and time was against him. Therefore, he requested to be relieved of command. This is not some admittance of guilt, but a product necessitated by his wife's dire condition. He wrote on December the 11th, 1864, that he found it very hard to part from a command with which he had been so long associated, a command that had made itself notorious for its gallant and meritorious deeds. As Wagner's division prepared for a brutal battle in Nashville, he packed his bags and departed camp with orders to proceed to Indianapolis. From there, he received his orders to assume command of the St. Louis district in the Department of Missouri, and did so on April the 8th, 1865. A few days later, he suffered a deeply personal loss. On Saturday, April the 29th, the Evansville Daily Journal reported the death of Miss Frances Wagner just days before he arrived to be at her side. After mustering out of the Army in June, Wagner relocated to Williamsport, Indiana, and began practicing law. Aside from his career, he went on to become a well-regarded and prominent Freemason, served as the president of the State Agricultural Society, and returned to his career in politics. In the years after the war, he hit the campaign trail hard for Republican candidates throughout Indiana. Newspapers would announce his arrival with an itinerary throughout the presidential election campaign of 1868. Wagner crisscrossed the state, attending meetings of the Grant Colfax Club and addressing crowds of fellow Republicans at various events. For his efforts, Grant awarded him the position of minister to Berlin. Before he departed for Germany, though, Wagner suffered a bout of nervous suffering and died after accidentally overdosing on his pain medication on February 13, 1869. Buried in the small Armstrong Cemetery near his home in Warren County, the former state senator, hero, and fierce defender of the Union faded into obscurity. If Wagner's story ended here, perhaps he would be regarded as one of the finest volunteer officers in the Army of the Cumberland. In the years following his death, however, his reputation suffered an intense, often inflated scrutiny which bore the myths that surround him today. The recent unpleasantness and Franklin, though a crucial battle, faded into memory until 1882. Other accounts in newspapers and pamphlets were published before then, but none quite matched the articles of Emerson Opdyke, the 2 volumes written by Jacob D. Cox, the writings of David Stanley, and John McAllister Schofield's military memoirs, 46 Years in the Army. All 4 veterans were eager, late in life, to make a claim for their credit in the victory at the battle. Perhaps the most zealous of the former officers was Emerson Opdyke. Strangely laid out, but we'll go with it. His resignation from the Army in 1865 ended an illustrious career as a citizen soldier. No one doubted his bravery or ability. On battlefields from Shiloh to Chickamauga, Opdyke distinguished himself as one of the finest volunteer officers in the Army. His actions at Franklin, renowned throughout the nation, earned him a promotion to brigadier general, and later the breveted rank of major general. Still, though, Opdyke felt as he had not gotten his proper credit for having saved the day. The ever-obstinate Opdyke persisted that his countercharge alone saved the Army. In 1882, steadfast in his belief that his actions prevented disaster for the Federals at Franklin, Opdyke demanded he be given credit for restoring the line and securing victory. His persistent claim for credit and glory angered his superiors and subordinates alike. By inflating his impact, however important it may have been, Opdyke, driven by his ego, refused to share in credit for the victory with Stanley and Cox, and most especially Schofield, who he held a vitriolic hate for. In 1882, discussing his planned sketch of the battle, Jacob D. Cox wrote to Opdyke saying, "You have for many years had a false idea of the scope of the Battle of Franklin." That Opdyke believed his 7 regiments alone reclaimed the abandoned works left Cox baffled, writing, "You supposed all Confederate forces moved by convergent lines in front of your brigade, and your view has been warped by this." He continued, "To correct this seems to deny you the really glorious service you did." But Opdyke remained dissatisfied with Cox's response. In September 1882, Opdyke published an article on his involvement in the battle in the New York Times. The story, though seemingly more a defense of George Thomas and an attack against Schofield, also demonstrated his inability to see the impact of the strenuous efforts made by his fellow officers and neighboring brigades, the 12th, 16th, 175th Ohio, and the 8th Tennessee. Opdyke's distortion of his role in the battle baffled Cox so much that he was compelled to respond to him, "I have reiterated again and again that despite the successful courage of the rest of your line, your charge saved the day, because holding the center would have been impossible had it broken." Opdyke's Times article provided the first post-war claim of George Wagner's alleged negligence. In Opdyke's narrative, he states that General Cox, after Schofield crossed the river, verbally ordered Wagner to retire his brigades in due time, but Schofield put Wagner's division into a position where usefulness was impossible. Of the disagreement with Wagner over the deployment along the outpost, Opdyke claimed that he thought the position so extremely faulty that he objected, and so was allowed to go into reserve on the rear slope of Carter's Hill. This is, of course, where Opdyke allegedly gave his final order to the 1st Brigade commander, saying, "Now, Opdyke, fight when and where you think best. I may not see you again." This was the only order that Opdyke claims he received during the battle. His interpretation of the events on the advanced line reinforces the idea that Wagner's 2 forward brigades were left out alone, not receiving any orders to retire. In John Schofield's military memoir, 46 Years in the Army, the former general-in-chief reflects on his 4 decades of service in the Army. Schofield's aim in recounting the events of the withdrawal from Pulaski to Nashville was to elevate his own reputation and diminish those of his detractors. Where David Stanley likened the night march at Spring Hill to walking on the thin crust covering a volcano, Schofield attributed much of his success to luck and happenstance. If anyone emerged a instant hero from the battle aside from Opdyke, it was David Stanley. A morning illness that would have left him indisposed, the wounded commander straining his last bit of effort in a desperate attempt to rally his soldiers, man, that has all the makings of a great war film. In 1893, he was awarded a Medal of Honor for his recounting of the awarded a Medal of Honor for his bravery at Franklin. However, Stanley's memoir, letters, and recounting of the action adds yet another fatal error to the narrative. In 1883, he wrote to a former comrade, Marshall Thatcher, that he believed Wagner to be full of whiskey, if not drunk, and in vainglorious condition at the time of the battle. It was in this alleged condition that Stanley claims Wagner ordered Conrad to fight them until hell froze over. This is the only account of drunkenness, so it would seem strange that this lone statement has become so cemented in the narrative. Of Opdyke, Stanley says, "Even Opdyke proved ingrate and turned against me, then joined Cox and afterwards committed suicide. I never knew a more daring man, but he had an ugly disposition that repelled all friendship, and he was full of envy and utterly untruthful. His unhappy nature, with his envious exercise of his mind, led to his self-destruction." Of Schofield, he says that he never profited by carrying water on both shoulders. He was a fair man, but his fear to politicians made him play a very low and mean part in many things. I could pick apart his chapters on Jonesboro and Franklin to pieces, but I do not think it worthwhile. But he assumed and appropriates circumstances entirely accidental and the run of luck in our favor as a result of his foresight and wisdom. Of Cox, Stanley states that many people will disagree with me when I say that this man has not in his whole nature one trait of truth or manhood. He is a very false knave. All of his writings are full of the spirit of falsehood. But Stanley's own account and his effort to, this is Stanley's own account and his effort to take his claim of share in the glory. In 1897, Cox published The Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, November 30th, 1864, a monograph. Rather than his earlier 1882 brief history of the campaign, his monograph focuses solely on the Battle of Franklin and addresses many of the controversies omitted in his earlier work. His able writing and thorough references of the now available official record, as well as privileged personal correspondence, provided insight into the, quote, apparently insignificant events that he claimed often became of great significance. Of those insignificant incidents, chief among them was what occurred at the outpost. His assessment of the battle is detailed, well-researched, and well-presented, with a thoroughness reflective of his years of practicing law and his newfound profession as a historian. What Cox presents is the most balanced narrative and recounting of the battle. Still, it is not without flaw. His treatment of Wagner does leave room for reinterpretation. Still, others like Schellenberger and Levi Tucker Schofield left their own marks on the story, but it should be remembered that neither of them wrote their accounts until after Opdyke, Stanley, Schofield, and Cox wrote theirs. From 1897 to 1983, very few publications. He is the one that lasts. Cox's narrative stands tall. From 1897 to 1983, very few publications even mentioned the destructive battle, much less focused on the action specifically. After Cox's Battle of Franklin, Thomas Hayes' Hood's Tennessee campaign stood alone as the only study of the battle and of the Confederate maneuvers from November to December of 1864. Much like the battle itself, literature on the Battle of Franklin simply disappeared as a concentration and interest shifted elsewhere. Noticing the glaring omission of any modern scholarship on Franklin, James Lee McDonough and Thomas Connolly joined together to produce a modern account of the battle. But rather than report the facts, as Cox left them for posterity, McDonough and Connolly engaged in sensational hit history. For 10 years later, Civil War historian and author Wiley Sword published Embrace an Angry Wind, which for 30 years, and to many today, stands as the definitive book on the Battle of Franklin. Both toss around serious allegations of words like negligence and incompetence and drunkenness and anger. Nothing was off limits for them. For almost 30 years, the story told to visitors to the two historic sites in Franklin, History Channel documentaries, newspapers, and magazines like the Civil War Times and the Monitor, centered around the myths and lies reported in these books. But what is true is that George Wagner's role at the Battle of Franklin needs continued examination. Almost every account and every statement about him can be easily refuted. The quest for post-war fame and glory by Opdyke, Schofield, and Stanley jeopardized the story, especially the sensationalism surrounding their claims. Jacob Cox, while unnecessarily hard on Wagner, attempted to preserve the truth and contest these false narratives promoted by the others. Sitting dormant for 86 years, the story of Franklin and the story of the Federals at the Battle of Franklin was as buried as the battlefield itself. By re-examining the battle and weighing primary sources in modern narratives, George Wagner emerges not as a villain, but as a wrongful scapegoat. The stories of Opdyke's lone attempt in saving the day, the story of him single-handedly throwing back the Confederate assault, only works if his noble disobedience to Wagner could stand. If not, then Wagner does what he is ordered to do, Joseph Conrad misses the mark, and Opdyke merely did what he was expected. Only recently has a concerted effort been made to turn back the page on the story and begin to seriously reevaluate the narrative. My many thanks go to Thomas Cartwright for introducing me to the story of the battle, Eric Jacobson and Joanna Stevens at the Battle of Franklin Trust for helping me on my quest in understanding this thing inside and out. But boy, I'll tell you, I've got a long way to go to catch up to them. And to the National Park Service Ranger and friend Lee White for being a constant sounding board for new ideas. Finally, I must thank a very important player in this story, Jacob D. Cox, for his commitment to maintaining the truth as best as he could find it and issuing a challenge. He wrote in 1897 that the task of the historian will be to reach the truth by running down and fixing the facts. Well, General Cox, I can only hope that I'm up to the task. Thank you. I think we have a minute for questions or so. Yeah.
How important is it for a military historian to walk the grounds of battle he's talking about?
How important is it for a military historian to walk the ground of the battle he's talking about? It is critically important. You can't understand a 2D map and be able to interpret an entire battle without actually walking on the same hills, looking at the heights, looking at the trees, what the overgrowth is like. Walking the ground is a crucial element in writing about any battle. Absolutely, and that's, I mean, you live and die by the walk you ground by the ground you walk on. So you've got to be able to examine it for yourself. Anybody else? I know I droned on for an awful long time. Well.